The war in Ukraine today taking an absolutely despicable turn. The Russian military reportedly targeting a maternity and children's hospital. Ukraine's president calling it an atrocity. Could this be what wakes up the average Russian citizen to Vladimir Putin's evil? Will that penetrate the propaganda there? It happened in the coastal city of Mariupol. It has been one of the hardest hit places in the conflict. No food, no water, no power for days. And now this, we're told at least 17 people were injured in the hospital bombing. There are also unconfirmed reports of large numbers of people trapped beneath the rubble. And it is important to note that many women and children have not been able to escape the city because the Russians were reportedly shelling the escape routes. And now police there warning refugees that it is too dangerous to leave, telling people to hide in their basements. Watch.
Everything is mined. The ways out of town are being shelled. At the moment, negotiations about living in security haven't been successful. Trust me, I have family at home and I am also worried about them. Unfortunately, the maximum security for all of us is to be inside the city, underground, and into shelters.
Of course, Mariupol isn't the only city Putin has his sights on. Here's a live look at the capital, Kyiv. 2 million people still there, waiting for the apocalypse. But for Ukrainian children who have already witnessed the horrors of this war and already lost parents, it is something they will never forget.
I hear a loud voice from bombs, and I'm really, and I don't like it.
Amnesty International now saying some of the attacks constitute war crimes, particularly the indiscriminate bombing of civilians, something that Vladimir Putin claims is not happening. Man, he is a gaslighter. What a horrible person. He's also said Ukraine is not a real country, so it's hard to take anything he says seriously. Just ask the Ukrainians what their country is. We're going to have more on his potential endgame a little later in the show with Mike Baker. We're also going to cover the Biden administration's response and the effect this is all having on gas prices. First, are we witnessing war crimes in Ukraine? Let's get into it with our Hump Night Man panel. That's right. We've got U.S. Army combat veteran and KTTH Seattle radio host, the one and only Bryan Suits, glasses off. That means the business is about to begin. We've got Democrat strategist and former Biden campaign surrogate. It is Kevin Walling. Hello, Dumpling. And
hey,
hi. And Georgia Libertarian gubernatorial candidate, love that word, host of The Radical with Shane Hazel. It's a podcast. He's a former Marine Corps sergeant. Shane Hazel is back. Welcome, everyone.
Good to see you,
Kennedy. Good to see you.
Hi. It's great to have a collection of people on tonight who know what they're talking about and who come from different perspectives to try and bring viewers some light and truth. I'm going to start with you, Suits, because I know you were involved in something very similar to this in Iraq. What did you think today when you saw the news about that bombing at the hospital?
I thought that that's not a targeting mistake. There's no explanation back at the squadron headquarters. That was intentional. That was a message. They know full well exactly what that particular structure is. They've got people on the ground there undercover. They know what they were doing. Because I believe it looked malicious and deliberate, it was a war crime.
So what do you do about that, Kevin? You know, if you've got things like this that, you know, normally we're used to seeing terrorists do this kind of stuff. You know, we're not familiar with these things, at least that are reported in the mainstream and theaters of traditional combat.
Yeah, Kennedy, it's horrific. You know, and to Brian's point, it's completely intentional what Putin is doing. We know he is upping the ante because his war effort and his invasion effort isn't going to plan. He thought he was going to blitzkrieg across the country in 2 days, capture the capital, and install a puppet regime, and that's not what's happening on the ground. So what does he have to do? He has to target civilians now, in his mind, in order to up the ante. That is horrifying, and I think if he steps off of Russian soil ever in the future, in any nation, he should be arrested, especially even if he comes to the UN. And I know there's precedent there where we don't arrest any foreign leader coming to New York City to address the United Nations. He should be arrested the moment he steps on U.S. territory. Any country that he steps in beyond Russia, he should be arrested on the spot and brought to The Hague.
So what does it take for people in Europe, people in Russia, to change their minds about what is happening in Ukraine, Shane?
Well, I think most people are probably pretty well united on the fact that Putin's a bad guy. But the problem is you've got a lot of bad guys across the board at very high levels, whether it's banks, whether it is the politicians, whether it's the bureaucrats or these other organizations that have interest here. And I think people need to be very, very careful about assigning blame in a lot of cases, especially in terms of maternity wars. Now, I'm not saying that Putin didn't do this, but I'm going to tell you right now, a lot of times, and I'll reference back to like Bashar al-Assad, when the NATO forces were leaving Syria, he was supposed to gas his own people. I think people need to be very, very slow to judge this entire situation because there are so many bad actors at very high levels that want us divided, separated, and at war. And I'm going to tell you, there's a lot of people in both the Republican and Democratic parties that would love to see this thing wag out so they can prolong their power with the U.S. fiat currency and their silly little positions in Washington, D.C. for as long as they can take because they are free falling right now.
I understand that, and I share your skepticism of a lot of people involved, not only here in high levels of authority, but around the globe, particularly those who run the oil cartels. But you have to admit there is something different about seeing pregnant women and babies targeted. And if Putin had nothing,
a great optic.
Yeah, it's a horrible optic. But if Putin had anything, it didn't have anything to do with this, there would be a forceful denial, which we haven't seen, right, Suits?
Absolutely. And also, I mean, I've seen enough raw video now over the past 14 days of Dancing with the Czars. That I'm convinced that, as usual, like when I was embedded with them in 1989 at Bosnia, that the average Russian soldier has received zero Geneva Conventions training. They're unaware of what their obligations are as a combatant in accordance with treaties that their country has signed. And they're terrified boys. The regular, whether they're the conscript guys or the contract guys, the regulars, they're terrified, and they're reacting like terrified little boys with guns.
Yeah, they are. And I can't imagine that seeing something like that, like pregnant, bleeding women being carried out on stretchers, enhances morale for the Russian side. And, to Shane's point, if you are trying to expand Russia, and if you're telling these people you are Russian, how about this? Don't kill them. And the situation, of course, getting much worse in Ukraine. But guess who's coming to the rescue? Vice President Kamala Harris. Today, the VP flew to Europe, where she's going to meet this week with leaders from Poland and Romania. That'll help. She's also going to be talking with Ukrainian refugees to reassure them of Washington's support. Her trip comes a day after the U.S. essentially rejected a surprise offer by Poland to transfer MiG-29 fighter jets to a U.S. base in Germany to help the Ukraine Air Force. The Pentagon today said the transfer of jets could be mistaken as escalatory. So is the VP up to handling all these complex diplomatic responsibilities? Kevin.
Well, I think she is. Obviously, she kicks off this trip to Poland. I do. And I think there's greater symbolism, too, in sending the American vice president to this area at this time. She's going to meet with refugees coming across the border. That's going to be an important symbolic act of the sitting vice president, regardless of how you feel about the vice president. And I'm a big fan of hers, and you know that. But regardless of how you feel about Kamala Harris, the fact that the sitting vice president is going to this area, she's going to be on the border, she's going to interact with those refugees, and that is incredibly important to show that America is committed to those people. We just passed over $10 billion worth of supplemental funding, both humanitarian and military aid, to support the efforts on the ground, and it's important to see her on the ground as well as part of that.
I will agree with you that she is the vice president. Shane, how can she screw this up?
Well, I mean, the only way she can't screw it up, or screw it up worse, is that they sent Joe Biden in. The idea that we're sending a woman who is supposed to go down to the U.S.-Mexico border and check things out, who hasn't been there yet, to the Ukrainian border, I think is bit of a stretch. She might be very well, in terms of handling the refugee, the women coming in with the kids, giving them juice and crackers and checking on them a little bit. But outside of that, I really don't think she's very well qualified to be there at all. I mean, the explanation she gave the other day,
Yeah. Here's her exact quote. Ukraine is a country in Europe. Bryan?
Yeah, I find that my curiosity in regards to what she'll say next has largely been satisfied with that quote, by the way. So I roll tape.
Yeah, she's basically going to go, we hear you, we see you, and we feel you. And now I'm here to touch you. All the senses have been satisfied. Thank you for hearing me hear you.
I'm ready to touch you, Kennedy, back in New York. I'm ready to get back up there.
I'm ready for you, Kevin. I'm ready for you.
Such a way.
All of the wonderful things that the future holds for us. You're so handsome.
You are.
Thank you. So my people, Shane, the Romanians, I don't know what she's going to say to them because they're pretty tough. They're pretty skeptical. They're smart. They can sense BS because they've been dealing with Russia for so long. Do you think they'll be able to sense that she doesn't read her briefing books, foreign policy and otherwise?
I think they're going to be dazzled by the amount of BS that comes out of her mouth, just enough to maybe hopefully snap some shots, get some video, and maybe have a Kamala highlight reel of blunders while she's over there. I don't like it. I don't like the president and the VP looking, terrible for everybody else because it gives Americans a bad name. But let's face it, these guys have kind of earned it at this point.
Yeah, and man, the BBC did quite a long story the other day on Joe Biden's slide. Suits, very quickly, before we leave this block, I want to ask you about Chernobyl because they've only got about 2 days of reserve diesel generators that are keeping the cooling pools intact. And when those run out of fuel, what's going to happen?
Well, if there was one more person who was on the fence about Russia somewhere in the world, that would be the end of that. I don't think there's any more Europeans that are curious what happens if the sarcophagus and the cooling is not maintained. It's already a bad scene when they were shooting illumination rounds into that other, the world's the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. At Chernobyl, we've seen the end of that story. Most people thought, well, is that still a thing? It's still a thing. It needs electricity. So if there's one more way that he can get bad publicity, I think he's found it.
Yeah, no, it's not an operation. It's not creating power. There are 2,000 people who work there just to make sure that the electricity stays on. It was like Lance Armstrong used to hire a guy just to stay in his apartment so the electricity stayed on so his own blood in his refrigerator wouldn't go bad. It's the same thing. All right, party panel is going to stick around.